Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this week's episode of Maritime Matters, the podcast where we discuss what's happening in the maritime domain in Australia and the wider Indo-Pacific. We're recording on Monday, the 22nd of July, a little bit later than normal, but hopefully we'll get this out to you nice and quickly. So how are you doing, Jen?
Hey, I am good, Richard. I think been lots happening in the world, lots happening over the weekend, and lots happening in maritime too. So very keen to get into another episode of Maritime Matters.
What have you been thinking about, reading about over the past week or so?
And what have I been thinking about and reading about? So I have a piece coming out in the Fin Review on Tuesday, the 23rd of July, just revisiting the conversation about Australia sending a ship to the Red Sea. I don't think the government is revisiting that conversation, but my piece is urging them to revisit. And I kind of highlight a couple of key reasons. Obviously, there is a strategic justification, but also I think the importance of allowing Australian Navy capabilities to experience ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, USVs, UAVs in a semi-benign environment compared to what a conflict in the region would look like, I actually think would be a really good benefit for understanding how our systems, radars, tactics, procedures perform. So that'll be us. Keep an eye out for that in the Fin Review on the 23rd of July. How about you, Richard? What have you been up to?
So I look forward to that piece being out because I think we were on the opposite sides of that debate last time round. I'll happily have a look at that and maybe we can pick it out a bit more next week. I had an article out in the Australian Journal of International Affairs last week looking at, more broadly, looking at kind of Australia's options if, for example, the United States were, or to provide itself with security in a world without the United States. And I try and do this from a kind of a theoretical background, not necessarily thinking the United States is going anywhere anytime soon, but there's been a lot of talk of Plan B. And so I try and do that. And in part, sort of, why am I doing this and why does it matter here? Well, it's trying to take something of a kind of maritime perspective on a lot of these issues and pushing back on some of what I see as the sort of the territorial focused ideas around defending Australia that dominate a lot of the discussion, particularly more recently coming from the likes of Hugh White. It's quite long, but it is open access. So if you're interested in discussions of how you defend Australia, take a look and tell me where I'm wrong. But I'll park that one, not purely maritime.
See the non-continental view, but then you don't support my position on the Red Sea. Something to definitely dig into in the next maritime.
Absolutely, yes, 100%. We are unquestionably a maritime nation, but that doesn't mean we have to be a global maritime nation. But we can take that one, next week. So, cracking on. What's been happening in the region this week?
A really big week. I mean, it's always a big week, right? Maritime Matters, to sound corny, but it's true. So I guess the first cab off the rank, there's not a lot of detail, but there was a report coming out on Sunday, the 21st of July. I'm just trying to check what date today is, that the Philippines and China have come to an agreement around Second Thomas Shoal. So I think this is interesting. Obviously, just to recap, we've seen some significant escalation in the vicinity of Second Thomas Shoal since the beginning of last year. Second Thomas Shoal, we've talked about a low tide elevation within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. It was looked at by a 2016 arbitral tribunal, but we have seen Chinese Coast Guard vessels use water cannons, ramming, and then we saw a significant escalation about a month ago now where we saw Chinese members wielding axes, pointing them at Philippines personnel, and a Philippines Navy member, I believe, losing a finger. So good to see that this has come out. Short on the detail in terms of what the deal entails, which, is to be expected. This is not necessarily the kind of thing that you publicise. So I think positive direction. What's your take on the China-Philippines agreement around Second Thomas Shoal?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to kind of know and say too much because there is so little by way of actual detail of what it is. As far as sort of has been released, it's a an agreement of some form, but both sides are sort of holding on to their position in terms of their territorial claims, etc. So there's no kind of stepping away from that, but it's an effort clearly to try and de-escalate and reduce the heat that has been in this issue for a little while. As we've said a couple of times, it's felt like it's sort of coming to the boil a little bit. So there have been a couple of this sort of de-escalation and conversations. I think we talked last time about the idea of the Philippines and China having sort of maritime consultations and that sort of thing. So this seems to be a further step on in that process. Clearly, a very good thing because, as I say, the tensions were getting to the stage where you felt like something significant or more significant could happen quite easily. Be interesting to see the detail and whether or not everyone sticks to it. It's very difficult, obviously, to know what they're sticking to because we don't know what's actually in the agreement. But at the moment, at least, it seems that both sides see value in stepping back from the brink, and I think that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, so I think the deal is important. We don't know, as you highlighted, much about it. And I think communications is always a benefit, if not for nothing else, but the sake of communications. As much as I try and be glass half full on most of things, I think otherwise the world's quite a depressing place to live. I do think about the 2012 agreement between China and the Philippines on Scarborough Shoal. So I think that needs to remain in the back of everybody's minds as they think about what's happening and the agreement at Second Thomas Shoal. So in 2012, there was a series of escalations around Scarborough Shoal. Slightly different to Second Thomas Shoal, but consistent kind of behaviour. There was a series of rumoured cyber attacks from China against the Philippines. China placed economic coercion measures on the Philippines. And so in the end, there was an agreement brokered between China and the Philippines, brokered by the US. And the agreement was something like both countries need to remove their military forces and paramilitary forces from the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines complied with the deal. China reneged on it, and since 2012, Scarborough Shoal, despite being part of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, has been under China's control. So I think it's positive that we now see this agreement around Second Thomas Shoal, but let's see how it develops.
Absolutely. Certainly something to keep an eye on, and I wouldn't necessarily guarantee that this is going to be a deal that's going to solve this problem, or in fact I can pretty much guarantee it's not going to solve the problem, but hopefully it'll provide us with a little bit of breathing space. Sticking with the South China Sea, there's been some quite interesting developments in terms of joint Chinese and Russian naval exercises and patrols, which again are kind of focused primarily in the South China Sea. So there's a naval exercise that's described as or called Maritime Cooperation 2024, which it appears from certainly from the Chinese reporting has a live fire component. This involves 2 Russian corvettes and a Russian resupply ship, alongside a Chinese DDG, 2 Chinese FFGs, and a Chinese resupply ship. So a reasonably significant force taking part in naval exercises. And at the same time, and I got a little confused by this, I thought it was all part of one thing, but seemingly separate, there is a joint Russia and Chinese naval patrol going on in the South China Sea, involving slightly more significant Russian forces. So interesting, both in terms of the sort of growing connection that seems to be sort of more widely between China and Russia, and there's been obviously a lot of discussion, not even so much in the maritime domain, but more widely about that kind of relationship, how the balances are shifting. But I think it's interesting to see it now playing out in the maritime domain in our region, or our region broadly viewed. And also quite interesting that there's this focus on the South China Sea.
It is, and I think certainly one to watch. For a long time, we've heard analysts and commentators underestimate the relationship between Russia and China, talking about the fact that they don't particularly trust each other historically, and so people overestimate the amount of collaboration that they are capable of. As much as the historical elements still remain prescient, I think that this increased collaboration that we're seeing, it's not just the year, over a number of years. I think back to 2022, when the Quad leaders, the 2022 the Quad leaders met in Tokyo, and there was a joint bomber patrol that flew past Japan between Russia and China. So this has been going on for a while. They are clearly increasing their interactions, and so I think it's something to watch. And I think as much as we shouldn't be alarmist about it, I don't think that we should underestimate the ability for them to collaborate in the military space just because of their history.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that the continued Russian focus on maritime in the Pacific at a time when obviously their primary resources and primary focus is very much elsewhere. So I guess that's again an indication of the degree to which they value this. Whether or not they'll manage to maintain that, I think is perhaps more questionable in terms of funding and capability, but that's a longer term issue.
So I guess moving from South China Sea and talking about kind of the China-Philippines deal and also what's been happening between China and Russia in terms of joint naval exercises, I do think, we talked about at the beginning of the show, but I do think it's time to head back to the Red Sea and in fact the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean to talk about what the Houthis have been up to. Richard, what have the Houthis been up to?
So more of the same in many regards, but there does feel like there's after there was an expectation, particularly coming after the largely Anglo-American strikes on Yemen and sort of regular strikes on Houthi targets, there was this expectation that somehow or other this would significantly degrade the Houthis' ability to target shipping in the Red Sea and more widely. That's clearly not happened. And actually, I think we're seeing a little bit of an uptick. I haven't actually run the numbers, but it'd be quite interesting to do that. That's actually something maybe I should.
So somebody has done that. Somebody has beaten you to that. And I have looked at them. Yep.
So has there been an uptick recently?
So there has been an uptick recently. It's probably now consistent with the number of attacks that were experienced in December 23. So an uptick in the last couple of months, but not the highest number of attacks per month, is what I took away from that quick look on the analysis. But maybe you should do your own analysis.
I think it'd be interesting because it does speak to this question of the ability to actually degrade these kind of capabilities using purely sort of airstrike and type approaches. But there have been some sort of significant attacks, most notably, and there's a pretty extraordinary kind of video of a USV attack on, and I'm going to mispronounce this now, but what I understand is that the Chios Lion, which is an oil tanker carrying Russian oil to Asia, seemingly unknown destination in Asia, as far as I can tell. And there is a huge explosion on this video. If you can go onto YouTube or wherever and have a look, it's quite remarkable. Apparently, only very little damage, and CENTCOM indicated that the ship did not request assistance, but it has since then turned round, and there has been reports of quite a significant oil spill in the Red Sea. So, ongoing issues here, which are causing, as I say, sort of multiple kind of chains of issues. So obviously, we've talked quite a lot about the insurance issues, and we're still seeing questions around shipping and shipping rates, and there's quite a lot of problems there. But even down to stuff like the environmental impact of this is really quite significant, and it's not going away. And I don't think it's going to go away until somebody comes up with a more permanent solution that's probably not going to be achieved by naval means or even military means. So I think this is something that's going to be a problem for some time to come. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, so I think it is. So I think it was at least 3 reported attacks last week using UAVs, USVs, and ballistic missiles. Thankfully, no loss of life seems to have been reported, but it is significant and shows that despite the semi-regular strikes from US, UK, supported by Australia apparently, and other countries since January this year, the Houthis are still managing to maintain their capability and I would suspect be resupplied in their capability from Iran. And there were rumours that Russia might look to support them as well. I'm not sure how verified that was. I think that it's something that we probably need more of a coordinated response on. I am an advocate for Australia providing more support to dealing with this, because I think the message that it sends to non-state actors and actors in terms of what are the consequences for interfering with maritime trade. And right now we're saying not so much. Perhaps the Houthis have bit off a little bit more they can chew over the weekend. So they have also, although less reported on, been conducting attempted strikes against Israel for the majority of this year. One of those UAV strikes actually got through late last week with some Israelis killed. And so there were retaliatory strikes from Israel into the port of Hudaydah over the weekend. So, look, I think it is one to watch. It is having an impact on global trade, and I think that we need to have a bit more of a coordinated response globally in terms of how we deal with this.
Yep, not going to disagree with that one, but we'll park our disagreement. I think let's maybe pick at it a little bit next week. Moving on and talking a little bit about capability, something that I've been interested in for a little while now, seemingly is now actually coming to pass, and this is that the US is deploying properly recoverable UUVs, which are to be effectively fired out of a torpedo tube on a submarine. They look like a bright yellow torpedo. You can tell I'm all up on the technical stuff here, right? But they are this idea of having UUVs which can be deployed from existing submarines, so you're not going to need to have major refits and rebuilds of submarines to try and be able to deploy these kind of things. So deploying through a regular torpedo tube, but can also be recovered, that's been the real issue for a long time now. There's been the ability to deploy them, but not then to recover them again. So this is going to be a real kind of game changer in terms of the ability to get these things to sea at sort of scale. And remarks from US Vice Admiral Rob Goucher, who's commander of the submarine forces, at a conference in the UK recently, really kind of highlighted this. So they're deploying in the next couple of weeks, starting with the USS Delaware, a Virginia-class submarine. I think they're using the Huntington Ingalls Industries Remus 600 to start off with, but I think this is a capability that we will see being used more widely, and really does have the potential to be a kind of a force multiplier for SSNs more generally. I also saw some interesting remarks, and I don't know if I've seen this flagged before, but the idea that this sort of launch and recover technology was being looked at as part of AUKUS Pillar 2. So the idea of this being shared obviously makes quite a lot of sense for the British, but whether or not that's likely to feature over here anytime soon, I don't know. What did you make of this story?
Look, I'm really excited by it. It's good. I think we spend so much time talking about uncrewed surface vessels and uncrewed underwater vessels, and I find myself having to point out to somebody on the weekend that, by and large, these things are actually not operational yet. Now, there's a few caveats to that. We talk about the US's Task Force 59 in the Arabian Gulf, and I think they have an equivalent down in the Caribbean where they use small ISR vessels. I've worked with them a lot. We talk about some of the small port protection, effectively ribs, uncrewed ribs. We talk about what's happening in Ukraine, but realistically, we haven't seen what had been predicted, which is the very rapid operationalization of UUVs and USVs in the same way that we did see UAVs rapidly operationalized. And so I do think sometimes their capabilities and their utility are overstated, but there is certainly a future for them. And so really good to see this. And you can imagine a whole heap of different ways that UUVs would be very helpful to a submarine. I just hope that this is something, I'm certain it is, the Australian Defence Force is looking at for its future capabilities. And you're right, hopefully under the kind of alignment of industrial bases under AUKUS Pillar 2, and AUKUS Pillar 2 certainly does have a UUV component. This is a capability that can be shared between the three countries. So I'm excited, but let's see what comes from it.
Yeah, well, I think that the really important thing here that the reason why this, to me, is such a exciting kind of development is the fact that, precisely for the reasons you're saying, that UUVs at the moment, big UUVs, ones that can go somewhere that matters, are actually still feel like they're a little way away. And we've seen that with issues with things like the Boeing Orca, and all sorts of other things that were supposed to be coming, and then we keep hearing they're a little bit further away. So these type of small things that don't have the kind of the legs to be able to actually deploy on their own to theatre, the ability to take them there, and then be able to use them. These type of bits of kit have been around and have been doing useful stuff for quite a while now. So we know that they work. It's about being able to get them there in a way that they can actually then do something useful once they get there. And this seems to be an obvious way to do that. So that's what I think is interesting and exciting about this, from that kind of perspective. Because I think you're right, we're still a ways away from the sort of the wondrous uncrewed future that we've been hearing about for quite a while.
We are, but we will delve into this in our promised Hellscape special episode that we are going to get to, because I think it's something worth really digging into. You know, I read a lot of academic papers that talk about UUVs and USVs taking over the world and rejigging the future of naval warfare, and I'm a little skeptical on those points.
Certainly in the next decade or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, what else has been going on? Lots of other exciting things from more of an Australian perspective.
There is. So HMAS Sydney, one of the Hobart-class destroyers, Australia's 3 Hobart-class destroyers from its now 10 major surface combatants, is at RIMPAC. And we talked about RIMPAC. Australia's contingent to RIMPAC is smaller than it has been historically. So last year, I think it was about 1,600 personnel. This year, it's about 320. But we are commanding the air component command for RIMPAC, so that's good to see. But Sydney has been doing a couple of things. So they razed with a German tanker. There was lots of press about that. I'm not sure that's super exciting. That's pretty common at RIMPAC for ships to razz with foreign tankers, especially when Australia hasn't sent its own tanker, which we traditionally have since RIMPAC came around in the 70s.
Presumably, the big question is whether they managed to get any German beer, right? That's going to be the important question about these kind of things.
It would be the important question, although remembering that the Royal Australian Navy has alcohol restrictions at sea. But anyway, I think more exciting, HMAS Sydney has fired a naval strike missile. So the first Australian surface combatant to fire a naval strike missile. They did it as part of RIMPAC's SyncX, where they grab an old US ship, and lots of different vessels line up and fire at it. And it's pretty exciting. It's a navigator's worst nightmare in terms of the screen, but it's pretty cool to do. So great to see that. And I think that, as much as many people are highly critical of the Australian Defence Forces, or Department of Defence, ability to integrate capabilities rapidly, I think NSM is an example where they have done this. Now, NSM is not only so it's an anti-surface missile. It has a slightly greater range than Harpoon, the current missile used by the Royal Australian Navy, but not significantly greater, to be honest. But I think it is a much more modern missile, and it's much harder for other ships to defeat. The first time it was fired at RIMPAC actually was 10 years ago by a Norwegian ship. But it is good to see. I think it was about 2022. I'd have to double check my figures there. But 2022, Australia announced that it would acquire the naval strike missile, and so 2024 we see it on a platform and being used. So I think it's a pretty good story. 2 caveats. Some of the reporting that's been happening today about it being a long-range strike makes me laugh. I don't really classify it as a long-range strike, but I think it is a much-needed improvement in the REN's capabilities. The second, I think now that there is a tendency for Australian media, Australian Department of Defence, and Australian analysts to always have to link everything to deterrence. So I saw lots of things about how the Royal Australian Navy's acquisition of the naval strike missile enhances Australia's strategy of deterrence, which I think is a significant leap. But either way, I do think it is a positive story. What do you think?
I love this narrative around deterrence. Like, no one else talks about the most basic bits of kit in terms of offering deterrence, right? Soon we're going to be talking about rifles and deterrence, right? I don't buy it. I think it's deeply problematic, but we're not going to go down that route. I've said my piece at various stages about AUKUS and deterrence and my problems around framing SSNs in terms of deterrence. But naval strike missile, that's a whole new kettle of fish. I think in terms of speed to capability, this is a good news story, right? You're absolutely right. It's also a really important kind of update. Harpoon has been around a long time. Kind of has its roots in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So this is a mid-Cold War capability. In obviously it's been updated massively since then, but that's its origins. So really important development, and hopefully we will see similar pace in terms of some of the other acquisitions that do perhaps offer a little bit more in terms of long-range strikes. So I'm thinking here of Tomahawk in particular. Coming back to your comments before about Australia's ability to engage Houthis in the Red Sea, and without things like that, there's actually relatively little ability to provide that kind of strike capability. So good news in that regard. Let's hope we see some more progress in terms of rapid capability acquisition.
And the thing I'd like to see too with the NSM, and I really do think from some of the stuff that Kongsberg have put out, and I think, Naval Strike Missile is a huge success story for Kongsberg, and they kind of deserve a pat on the back. The US is acquiring Naval Strike Missile, a lot of countries are. But I do hope that there is a capacity for Australia to take its guided weapons enterprise, which has been talked about substantially since 2020, significant investment, little practical delivery at this stage that you can see in the public space anyway, and take something like NSM and start building that in Australia. I think that would be a really good win, and it's a great missile, but it's not the most complex of missiles compared to some other things we might discuss building in Australia. So I think that would be a really important next step.
Yeah, and add to the wider kind of alliance pool, and we're only talking in terms of Ukraine and everywhere else about the challenges of upscaling acquisitive sort of build of and construction of guided munitions. So absolutely, if this can be the kind of thing that that Guio can jump on board with, it makes a lot of sense. What else has been going on in terms of capability?
So something we haven't really touched on much, but it's kind of fundamental to maritime issues in the region, which is the decommissioning, or the rapid decommissioning, to be honest, of Australian Navy's hydrographic capabilities. Now, never was a hydrographer, can't even pronounce the word, so definitely wouldn't have passed the course. But do have quite a fondness. I did get my navigation watchkeeping certificate in a hydrographic ship, and my third ever ship was HMAS Lewin, unfortunately conducting Resolute, or Relics as it was in the days. But I think, hydrography is such an important capability in any Navy, especially the Royal Australian Navy, and it's not often talked about, and it's often underestimated. Now, something that didn't really get a lot of discussion is around the FSP timing. It might have been just before the FSP Force Structure Plan released in Australia in 2020. There was a decision to outsource a lot of the hydrographic requirements. So that is the charting. And so I'm going to get a little bit geeky, but under the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea in 1974, the Australian government, I'm a geek, not as much of a geek as you, the Australian government does have an international obligation to provide hydrographic services covering the Australian charting area. Right, and then under the Navigation Act 2012, that is actually delegated to Defence. And in fact, I've been told this, I've never been the fleet commander, not yet, but I have been told that in his list of tasking, hydrography is right up there as one of the key things that he used to ensure happens for the Royal Australian Navy and wider Australia. So this investment in Hydro Scheme was really about bolstering the civilian hydrographic capabilities in Australia as Australia sought to decommission its hydrographic ships. So it had 4 survey motor launchers, warship Mermaid, love that name, Benalla, Paluma, and forget the other one, which I also served in. But they decommissioned over the last couple of years. So all that was left was HMAS Lewin and HMAS Melville, which are slightly larger ships, which have also been used for ops sovereign borders, relics, those kind of things. Melville, it's been announced, is decommissioning on the 8th of August this year. Largely expected. Third Royal Australian Navy ship to decommission this year, and so that review recommendation that the Navy grows is not being met. It's still getting smaller. But I think there is a real question about what hydrographic capability does Australia need, what needs to be delivered by defence, and what needs to be delivered in a civilian capacity. And it's not just charting, right? When you think of amphibious operations, hydrographic surveying is a key element of that. And so I think there is a real question about what is the future of this capability. Now, there was, around the time of the FSP, a view that something like the offshore patrol vessels would be used as the future vessel for mine countermeasures, but also hydrography. Now, with that going, the decision for C-19 to move to autonomous mine countermeasures and no vessel on the horizon, I think the decommissioning of Melville really needs to raise a question of what is the capability that is needed and how is that being serviced? And I think we're probably going to find, like in MCM, that there is a gap there. Yeah. What do you think about saying goodbye to Melville?
I think more broadly, it fits with, as you say, the obvious sort of counterpoint is compatriot is the MCM piece, and they've also got similarities in the regard that this is something that you hear quite a lot of people talking about as just being, autonomous will do this, right? And to a degree, it kind of does. Like if you look at how the commercial outfits do this, they are now very, very heavily reliant on sort of both USVs and to a lesser extent, I think UUVs to do quite a lot of the survey work. But I do have reservations about the idea of just outsourcing everything, particularly when, as far as I'm aware, and I might be corrected on this, but there's not a huge capability of doing this sort of open ocean type stuff or broader stuff in Australia. So a lot of the expectation would be basically to pay outsources to foreign companies to do. So it fits uncomfortably, and particularly because there is actually a wider narrative going on in our region around hydrographic survey, and the Chinese, most notably, are doing a lot of hydrographic survey in particularly the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific. And they're actually then running up against, I think, the Indians. There have been a couple of points of friction there where they are also very interested in hydrographic survey. A lot of this is around supporting submarine operations. So I think this is something which is beginning to play out a kind of a geopolitical type level. And so again, on that regard, it feels like an slightly odd time to be in what might be seen as kind of cutting corners a little bit in this area. But I'm happy to be corrected by those who have all the answers in terms of this sort of thing.
And I am happy to be corrected by those who pronounce the word hydrography. But I do think this is part of this wider conversation, right? And this theme about what are the maritime functions that Australia needs to deliver to support our national security? What elements of those functions need to be supported by the Department of Defence? And how do we go about delivering them? And I do think that, and I understand how the Surface Combatant Fleet Review came about, and it makes sense as a linear process. I understand how AUKUS came about. I'd say it makes sense. I'm not sure you agree on that point. But I think that there hasn't been this wider step back and say, what do we need to achieve? What are those functions? What are those organisations? What are those capabilities? There's a huge focus on Australia's need for a submarine capability, nuclear-powered submarine capability. There is a huge focus on the need to grow the fleet, although I would say probably not in the time frame that is going to be strategically relevant. But I think there's less of a focus on what is the full spectrum of maritime capabilities that need to be delivered. And I keep talking about my beleaguered Coast Guard paper, which is going to be released in September now. It is on track.
We've been hearing about this for a long time.
It's hard to write.
As long as people have been talking about an Australian maritime strategy, right?
That's true. That is true. They go hand in hand, really. But I think that there is this need to just have this step back and this wider look of, we're trying to sort out the ships, we're trying to sort out the submarines, but they are not the only functions that a Navy delivers, and they are not the only maritime functions that a government delivers that supports national security. So how is the rest linking together? And I think, the Hydro example, we've talked about MCM, we haven't talked about clearance diving, but we can get into that. I think all of these things, they're kind of symptomatic of not having that holistic view of Australia's maritime needs.
Yeah,
I'll
and there
stop
also
preaching.
feels a little bit like there's questions over the kind of teeth to tail ratios, and this has been something I think that people have pointed out a lot about Western militaries since the end of the Cold War, that we pay a lot of attention to the snazzy, exciting frontline bits of kit, and have eroded away a lot of the capabilities that are necessary to support that, and it feels like we haven't necessarily quite caught up in that conversation here. Well, we have in places things like GUIO, which we've already talked about, is exactly that kind of thing. But I do wonder, we've talked an awful lot about things that fire missiles and torpedoes in terms of the Australian naval kind of capability frame. We've talked a lot less about the wider things that achieve effects in the maritime domain. To use the jargon that then makes me kind of question, what do I actually mean by any of this stuff? But I think that the point broadly stands.
Well, I think we are well over time, Richard, so
Absolutely.
we probably need to wrap it up. Thanks, Richard. It's been a great Maritime Matters.
Absolutely. Always good to chat. And as ever, Maritime Matters. Keep